Saint Augustine on the Most Holy Trinity, Book 14. Content of Book 14. The true wisdom of man is treated of, and it is shown that the image of God, which man is in respect to his mind, is not placed properly in transitory things as in memory, understanding and love, whether of faith itself as existing in time, or even of the mind as busied with itself, but in things that are permanent, and that this wisdom in there is then perfected when the mind is renewed in the knowledge of God, according to the image of him who created man after his own image, and thus attains to wisdom, wherein that which is contemplated is eternal. Chapter 1. What the wisdom is of which we are here to treat, whence the name of philosopher arose, what has been already said concerning the distinction of knowledge and wisdom. We must now discourse concerning wisdom, not the wisdom of God, which without doubt is God, for his only begotten Son is called the wisdom of God. See Ecclesiasticus chapter 24 verse 5 and 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 24. But we will speak of the wisdom of man, yet of true wisdom, which is according to God and is his true and chief worship. And the Greek term, as we have already observed, when our own countrymen themselves also wish to interpret it by a single term, was by them rendered piety, whereas piety means more commonly. But because to be translated perfectly by any word, it is better translated by two, so as to render it rather by the worship of God, that this is the wisdom of man, as we have already laid down in the 12th book of this work, is shown by the authority of Holy Scripture in the book of God's servant Job, where we read that the wisdom of God said to man, "Behold, piety that is wisdom, and to depart from evil is knowledge." Sometimes translated learning, in Latin disciplina, which certainly takes its name from learning, whence also it may be called knowledge, for everything is learned in order that it may be known, although the same word indeed is employed in a different sense, where anyone suffers evils for his sins, that he may be corrected. Whence is that in the epistle to the Hebrews, "For what son is he to whom the Father gives not discipline?" And this is still more apparent in the same epistle. Now, no chastening, disciplina in Latin, for the present seems to be joyous but grievous. Nevertheless, afterward it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness, and to them which are exercised thereby. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 7 and 11. Therefore God himself is the chiefest wisdom, but the worship of God is the wisdom of man, of which we now speak. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness with God. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 19. It is in respect to this wisdom, therefore, which is the worship of God, that Holy Scripture says, "The multitude of the wise is the welfare of the world." Book of Wisdom, chapter 6, verse 26. But if to dispute of wisdom belongs to wise men, what shall we do? Shall we dare indeed to profess wisdom, lest it should be mere impudence for ourselves to dispute about it? Shall we not be alarmed by the example of Pythagoras, who dared not profess to be a wise man, but answered that he was a philosopher, i.e., a lover of wisdom. Whence arose the name that became thenceforth so much the popular name, that no matter how great the learning wherein any one excelled, either in his own opinion or that of others in things pertaining to wisdom, he was still called nothing more than philosopher. Or was it for this reason that no one even of such as these dared to profess himself a wise man, because they imagined that a wise man was one without sin? But our scriptures do not say this, which say, "Rebuke a wise man, and he will love thee." Proverbs chapter 9, verse 8. For doubtless he who thinks a man ought to be rebuked judges him to have sin. However, for my part, I dare not profess myself a wise man even in this sense. It is enough for me to assume what they themselves can't deny, that to dispute of wisdom belongs also to the philosopher, i.e., the lover of wisdom. For they have not given others, so disputing, who have professed to be lovers of wisdom rather than wise men. In disputing then about wisdom, they have defined it thus: wisdom is the knowledge of things human and divine, and hence, in the last book, I have not withheld the admission that the cognizance of both subjects, whether divine or human, may be called both knowledge and wisdom. But according to the distinction made in the Apostle's words, to one is given the word of wisdom, to another the word of knowledge, 1 Corinthians 13:12. This definition is to be divided, so that the knowledge of things divine shall be called wisdom, and that of things human appropriate to itself the name of knowledge. And for the latter I have treated in the 13th book, not indeed so as to attribute to this knowledge everything whatever that can be known by man about things human, wherein there is exceeding much of empty vanity and mischievous curiosity, but only those things by which that most wholesome faith, which leads to true blessedness, is begotten, nourished, defended, strengthened. And in this knowledge most of the faithful are not strong, however exceeding strong in the faith itself. For it is one thing to know only what man ought to believe in order to attain to a blessed life, which must needs be an eternal one, but another to know in what way this belief itself may both help the pious and be defended against the impious, which last the Apostle seems to call by the special name of knowledge. And when I was speaking of this knowledge before, my especial business was to commend faith, first briefly distinguishing things eternal from things temporal, and there discoursing of things temporal. But while deferring things eternal to the present book, I showed also that faith respecting things eternal is itself a thing temporal, and dwells in time in the hearts of believers, and yet is necessary in order to attain the things eternal themselves. I argued also that faith respecting the things temporal which he that is eternal did and suffered for us as man, which manhood he bare in time and carried on to things eternal, is profitable also for the obtaining of things eternal, and that the virtues themselves whereby in this temporal and mortal life men live prudently, bravely, temperately, and justly, are not true virtues unless they are referred to that same faith, temporal though it is, which leads on nevertheless to things eternal. Chapter 2. There is a kind of Trinity in the holding, contemplating, and loving of faith temporal. but one that does not yet attain to being properly an image of God. Wherefore, since, as it is written, while we are in the body, we are absent from the Lord, for we walk by faith, not by sight, 2 Corinthians 5, verses 6 and 7. Undoubtedly, so long as the just man lives by faith, Romans 1:17, howsoever he lives according to the inner man, although he aims at truth and reaches on to things eternal, by this same temple of faith, nevertheless in the holding, contemplating, and loving this temple of faith, we have not yet reached such a Trinity as is to be called an image of God, lest that should seem to be constituted in things temporal, which ought to be so in things eternal. For when the human mind sees its own faith, whereby it believes what it does not see a thing eternal. For that will not always exist, which certainly will not then exist, when this pilgrimage whereby we are absent from God, in such way that we must needs walk by faith, shall be ended, and that sight shall have succeeded it, whereby we shall see face to face. 1 Corinthians 13:12. Just as now, because we believe, although we do not see, we shall deserve to see, and shall rejoice at having been brought through faith to sight. For then it will be no longer faith by which that is believed which is not seen, but sight by which that is seen which is believed. And then, therefore, although we remember this past mortal life, and call to mind by recollection that we once believed what we did not see, yet that faith will be reckoned among things past and done with, not among things present and always continuing. And hence also that Trinity which now consists in the remembering, contemplating, and loving this same faith, while present and continuing, will then be found to be done with and past and not still enduring. And hence it is to be gathered that if that Trinity is indeed an image of God, then this image itself would have to be reckoned not among things that exist always, but among things transient. Chapter 3. A difficulty removed which lies in the way of what has just been said. But far be it from us to think that while the nature of the soul is immortal, and from the first beginning of its creation thenceforth never ceases to be, yet that which is the best thing it has should not endure forever with its own immortality. Yet what is there in its nature as created better than that it is made after the image of its Creator? Genesis 1:27. We must find then what may be fittingly called the image of God, not in the holding, contemplating, and loving that faith which will not exist always, but in that which will exist always. Shall we then scrutinize somewhat more carefully and deeply whether the case is really thus? For it may be said that this Trinity does not perish even when faith itself shall have passed away, because as now we both hold it by memory and discern it by thought and love it by will, so then also, when we shall both hold in memory and shall recollect that we once had it, and shall unite these two by the third, namely will, the same Trinity will still continue. Since, if it have left in its passage as it were no trace in us, doubtless we shall not have aught of it even in our memory, whereto to recur when recollecting it as past, and by the third wise purpose, coupling both these, to wit, what was in our memory though we were not thinking about it, and what is formed thence by conception. But he who speaks thus does not perceive that when we hold, see, and love in ourselves our present faith, we are concerned with the different Trinity as now existing, from that Trinity which will exist, when we shall contemplate by recollection not the faith itself, but as it were the imagined trace of it laid up in the memory, and shall unite by the will as by a third these two things, viz., that which was in the memory of him who retains, and that which is impressed thence upon the vision of the mind of him who recollects. And that we may understand this, let us take an example from things corporeal, of which we have sufficiently spoken in the 11th book. For as we ascend from lower to higher things, or pass inward from outer to inner things, we first find a Trinity in the bodily object which is seen, and in the vision of the seer, which, when he sees it, is informed thereby, and in the purpose of the will which combines both. Let us assume a Trinity like this, when the faith which is now in ourselves is so established in our memory as the bodily object we spoke of was in place, from which faith is formed the conception in recollection, as from that bodily object was formed the vision of the beholder, and to these two to complete the Trinity, will is to be reckoned as a third, which connects and combines the faith established in the memory, and a sort of effigy of that faith impressed upon the vision of recollection, just as in that Trinity of corporeal vision, the form of the bodily object that is seen, and the corresponding form wrought in the vision of the beholder, are combined by the purpose of the will. Suppose then that this bodily object which was beheld was dissolved and had perished, and that nothing at all of it remained anywhere, to the vision of which the gaze might have recourse. Are we then to say that because the image of the bodily object thus now past and done with remains in the memory, whence to form the conception in recollecting, and to have the two united by will as a third, therefore it is the same Trinity as that former one, when the appearance of the bodily object posited in place was seen? Certainly not, but altogether a different one. For not to say that that was from without, while this is from within, the former certainly was produced by the appearance of a present bodily object, the latter by the image of that object now past. So too, in the case of which we are now treating, to illustrate which we have thought good to adduce this example, the faith which is even now in our mind as that bodily object was in place, while held, looked at, loved, produces a sort of Trinity, but that Trinity will exist no more, when this faith in the mind, like that bodily object in place, shall no longer exist. But that which will then exist, when we shall remember it to have been, but not now to be in us, will doubtless be a different one. For that which now is what by the thing itself, actually present and attached to the mind of one who believes. But that which shall then be will be wrought by the imagination of a past thing left in the memory of one who recollects. Chapter 4. The image of God is to be sought in the immortality of the rational soul, how a Trinity is demonstrated in the mind. Therefore, neither is that Trinity an image of God which is not now, nor is that other an image of God which then will not be. But we must find in the soul of man, i.e., the rational or intellectual soul, that image of the Creator which is immortally implanted in its immortality. For as the immortality itself of the soul is spoken with a qualification, since the soul too has its proper death, when it lacks a blessed life, which is to be called the true life of the soul, but it is therefore called immortal because it never ceases to live with some life or other, even when it is most miserable. So, although reason or intellect is at one time torpid in it, at another appears small and at another great, yet the human soul is never anything save rational or intellectual. And hence, if it is made after the image of God in respect to this, that it is able to use reason and intellect in order to understand and behold God, then, from the moment when that nature so marvelous and so great began to be, whether this image be so worn out as to be almost known at all, or whether it be obscure and defaced or bright and beautiful, certainly it always is. Further, too, pitting the defaced condition of its dignity, divine scripture tells us that although man walks in an image, yet he disquieteth himself in vain. He heaps up riches and can tell who shall gather them. It would not therefore attribute vanity to the image of God, unless it perceived it to have been defaced. Yet, it sufficiently shows that such defacing does not extend to the taking away its being an image by saying, although man walks in an image. Wherefore, in both ways that sentence can be truly enunciated, in that, as it is said, although man walks in an image, yet he disquieteth himself in vain. So it may be said, although man disquieteth himself in vain, yet he walks in an image. For although the nature of the soul is great, yet it can be corrupted, because it is not the highest. And although it can be corrupted because it is not the highest, yet because it is capable and can be partaker of the highest nature, it is a great nature. Let us seek then in the image of God a certain Trinity of a special kind, with the aid of Him who Himself made us after His own image. For no otherwise can we healthfully investigate this subject or arrive at any result according to the wisdom which is from Him. But if the reader will either hold in remembrance and recollect what we have said of the human soul or mind in former books, and especially in the 10th, or will carefully reperuse it in the passages wherein it is contained, he will not require here any more lengthy discourse respecting the inquiry into so great a thing. We said then, among other things, in the 10th book, that the mind of man knows itself, for the mind knows nothing so much as that which is close to itself, and nothing is more close to the mind than itself. We adduced also other evidences as much as seemed sufficient, whereby this might be more certainly proved.